The morning of August 15th, 1886, broke over Red Bluff like a fever. The sun beat down on the unpainted planks of the First Union Church, baking the pine wood until it wept resin. Inside, the air was thick enough to chew, heavy with the scent of dry dust, sweat, and the sour righteousness of a congregation gathered not for worship, but for a spectacle. Jonah Cole stood at the altar, rigid as a fence post. He stared at a dark knot in the floorboards, tracing its whorls with his eyes, seeing in them the tangled mess his life had become. At 34, his face was already a map of hard miles and quiet sorrows, carved by the New Mexico sun and the grief that had hollowed him out since his wife, Eleanor, had been taken by the winter cough 2 years prior. His hands, broad and calloused from rope and rain, were clenched at his sides. Every nail, every plank of this church felt like a betrayal. He had built his life with Eleanor on the promise of their ranch, Half Moon, a promise he was now breaking to save it. Beside him, but a world away, stood Lila Hart. She was not the blushing bride the town might have expected. At 29, with no family to speak for her and a mind sharper than most men were comfortable with, Red Bluff had already labeled her a spinster. She wore a traveling dress of dark, practical serge, the collar high and unadorned. Her chin was lifted, her gaze fixed not on the floor or the preacher, but on the man who had arranged this whole affair, Silas Pike. She was a woman cornered, but she would not be a woman cowed. This was a transaction, and she would see the terms. Silas Pike sat in the front pew, looking for all the world like the town's benevolent patriarch. He was a thick man, his waistcoat strained across a prosperous belly. As the owner of the Red Bluff Bank and the local agent for the expanding railroad, he held the fates of most of the folks in this valley in his ledger book. He smiled a thin, satisfied smile. The architect of this union, he had not needed a literal weapon to force this wedding. The threat of foreclosure, signed and sealed, was a far more effective instrument. Reverend Miller, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by boiled noodles, cleared his throat and began. His words about holy matrimony and sacred bonds were empty vessels, clattering into the thick silence. The whole town knew the truth. Jonah Cole was drowning in a debt he had not created, a ruinous loan his late wife's father had co-signed, and Silas Pike was offering him an anchor, tied to the schoolteacher's ankle. A good woman's influence is what this town values, Pike had declared at the bank 2 days before, his voice smooth as oiled machinery. And your little girl, Jonah, a child needs a mother. The town council agrees. A moral example must be set. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Pike's concern for morality extended only as far as it served his acquisition of land along the new railroad survey line. And the town council, most of them in his debt, had nodded along like puppets on a string. The ceremony was mercifully brief. When the time came for the signing of the registry, Pike stepped forward, producing not the church's leather-bound book, but a crisp set of legal papers, a formality. He announced to the pews, a simple agreement codifying my good faith, a 6-month deferment on the Cole property's debt, in consideration of this union, which will provide a stable home for the child. He placed the document on the small wooden table, next to a pot of ink and a freshly sharpened pen. Jonah moved to sign, his jaw a hard line of stone. He just wanted it over. Wait. Lila's voice was not loud, but it cut through the room with the clarity of a bell. Every head turned. Jonah paused, his hand hovering over the paper. She stepped forward, her dark skirt whispering against the floorboards. She looked directly at Silas Pike. Before we sign, Mr. Pike, I believe the community should understand the full measure of your generosity. Would you please read this clause aloud? She pointed a steady finger to a dense paragraph in the middle of the page, the one pertaining to the terms of interest on the deferred loan. A murmur went through the church. This was not part of the script. Pike's smile tightened at the edges. Miss Hart, I assure you, it is all standard. Please, she insisted, her voice unwavering, so that all here may act as witness to this contract they are so invested in. Trapped by his own performance of public piety, Pike had no choice. His face reddened slightly as he picked up the paper. He cleared his throat and began to read, his voice losing its buttery smoothness and taking on a clipped, formal tone. The words that came out were a tangle of legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. The interest rate was predatory, compounding in a way that would make it nearly impossible for Jonah to ever climb out from under it. The 6-month deferment was not a lifeline. It was merely a longer chain. As Pike read, Lila watched the paper, her eyes scanning the lines. And then she saw it. A small, seemingly insignificant detail. The effective date of the loan agreement was listed as July 15th, a full month before this day, August 15th. Her mind, trained to notice the smallest discrepancies in a student's sums, snagged on the inconsistency. Why would the terms begin a month before the agreement was even signed? It was a crack, a tiny fissure in the foundation of Pike's legal fortress. She said nothing. She filed the observation away. A single, sharp stone she might need later. When he finished, a tense silence filled the church. Pike set the paper down with a definitive slap. As I said, standard. Lila gave a small, deliberate nod. She picked up the pen, dipped it in the ink, and signed her name, Lila Hart, with clean, precise strokes. Then she looked at Jonah. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, held no plea, only a quiet statement of fact. We are in this. Let us get it done. Jonah took the pen. His signature was a jagged slash of ink, the name of a man signing away more than a debt. The deed was done. He was married. There was no kiss, no joyful pronouncements, just the dry scratch of the pen and the suffocating heat. The small congregation began to shuffle out, whispering behind their hands. Jonah could feel their stares, a mixture of pity for him and a fresh, sharp judgment for his new wife, Mrs. Miller, the Reverend's wife and head of the school board, gave Lila a look that was as cold and hard as a winter frost. The unspoken rule was clear: a married woman's place was in the home, not in front of a blackboard. Lila's career had been signed away along with Jonah's land. The only person who approached them was Molly O'Rourke, Jonah's housekeeper, a woman built like a draft horse, with a face that looked like it had been in a long argument with the world. Molly was the closest thing Jonah had to family. She placed a firm, comforting hand on Lila's arm. Come on, child, let's get you home. Home. The word hung in the air between them. Half Moon Ranch was Jonah's home, Eleanor's home. For Lila, it was a gilded cage. Jonah's 6-year-old daughter, Maddie, had not been at the church. She had refused, locking herself in a room with a quiet, stubborn fury that Jonah had no idea how to breach. She is not my mother, she had whispered, her small face pale with a child's absolute grief. You promised. And he had. In the raw days after Eleanor's death, he had held his weeping daughter and promised he would never replace her mother. A promise he had just broken in front of God and the entire town of Red Bluff. The wagon ride to the ranch was a study in silence. Jonah handled the reins, his shoulders set, his eyes on the horizon. Lila sat on the hard bench beside him, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The space between them was a canyon of unspoken resentments and fears. He was a man shackled to the memory of a ghost. She was a woman shackled to a stranger. As the wagon rumbled onto Half Moon Land, the vast expanse of grama grass spread out before them, shimmering in the heat. It was beautiful, rugged country, a place of stark mesas and endless sky, a place a person could believe in. But as they crested a low rise, something new caught Jonah's eye. There, driven deep into his pasture, was a wooden stake. Its top was painted a garish, angry red, a railroad survey marker. It had not been there a week ago. It stood as a brazen announcement of Silas Pike's true intentions. This was never just about a debt. It was about the water rights, the flat passage through the valley, the path of iron and steam that was coming to swallow the west whole. The marker was a tombstone for a way of life, placed squarely in the heart of the land Jonah had just sold his soul to protect. He pulled the horses to a stop. For a long moment, neither he nor Lila spoke. The stake was an accusation. It mocked the sacrifice he had just made, the cold bargain she had accepted. Lila was the first to break the silence. Her voice was low, devoid of emotion. "He wants your water, not just your land." Jonah's knuckles were white on the reins. He gave a short, bitter nod. "The railroad needs water for the steam engines. My spring is the only reliable one for 20 miles. He did not look at her, but he felt her shift on the seat. She was looking at the rope coiled neatly beside his saddle. It was a simple tool of his trade, a length of sturdy hemp he used for everything from roping calves to pulling a wagon from the mud. But in the charged silence of that afternoon, it seemed to be something more, a symbol of the knots that now bound them, not just to each other, but to Silas Pike and the relentless future barreling down on them. He was tied to a promise he made to the dead. She was tied to a man who did not want her, and both of them were tied to a piece of paper that could strangle them both. Jonah clucked to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward, carrying them toward a house that was not a home, toward a life neither of them had chosen, under the shadow of a single red stake that promised nothing but a fight. The first layer of conflict was clear a man's grief against a woman's pride, but Lila's sharp eye had already found a different battle line, a flaw in the enemy's armor, a battle to be fought not with ropes and force, but with ink and nerve. The question was whether the man beside her, lost in his own past, would be willing to fight it with her. The silence in the house at Half Moon Ranch was a living thing. It settled in the corners like dust and lay heavy on the dinner table, a fourth presence in the room. Every evening, Molly O'Rourke would set out 3 plates, 3 forks, and 3 cups, and every evening, they would sit in the same configuration, Jonah at the head of the table, his daughter Maddie on his right, and Lila on his left, with the chair between her and Maddie conspicuously empty. It was Eleanor's chair. No one said it, but the space it occupied was louder than any conversation they might have had. Jonah ate with a grim focus, his eyes on his plate. He was a man adrift in his own home. The scent of Lila's lavender soap, a small comfort she had brought from the east, was a constant, subtle intrusion. It was not the familiar scent of wood smoke and rosemary that had been Eleanor. He would catch himself watching Lila's hands as she cut her food, noting their slender efficiency, and a sharp, bitter guilt would rise in his throat. It felt like a betrayal to simply notice her. Maddie, for her part, had erected a wall of silence around herself. She spoke only to her father, and only in whispers, as if Lila were a dangerous phantom who might overhear. She would not look at Lila, would not acknowledge her presence beyond angling her small body away as if to avoid contamination. Lila endured it with a quiet fortitude that was beginning to fray at the edges. She had been an outsider her entire life, but this was a new, more intimate kind of exile. She was a ghost in another woman's house, a wife with no husband, a mother with no child. The days were long and empty. Molly, though not unkind, kept a respectful distance, leaving the running of the house to the woman who was now its mistress in name only. Lila spent her time trying to bring order to the small, neglected garden behind the house, pulling weeds with a ferocity that did little to uproot the bitterness growing inside her. One afternoon, a week after the wedding, the oppressive quiet was shattered by a sound of pure violence. A sharp crack of wood, a horse's terrified scream, and a man's grunt of pain. Lila dropped her trowel and ran toward the corral. Jonah was trying to gentle a young sorrel gelding, a wild thing with fire in its eyes. The horse had spooked. Slamming Jonah against a fence post, the top rail had splintered, and the gelding, now frantic, was kicking and bucking in the center of the enclosure. Jonah was on his knees, clutching his left forearm. Blood, dark and shockingly red, was seeping through his fingers and dripping into the dust. Lila did not hesitate. She slipped through the rails, her voice low and calm. "Easy now, easy, boy." She spoke to the horse, not the man, her movements slow and deliberate as she approached. The gelding's ears swiveled, its eyes rolling, but the panicked energy began to subside under the steady influence of her voice. Jonah looked up, his face pale under its tan. "Get back," he rasped. "He is not broken yet." "Neither are you," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. She reached his side and knelt in the dirt, gently prying his hand away from the wound. It was a deep, ragged gash, laid open to the bone, with a long sliver of wood embedded in the flesh. "This needs cleaning, and stitches. Molly can do it." "Molly is in town for supplies," Lila stated simply, "and this cannot wait. The house, now." For a moment, he resisted, his pride warring with the pain that was beginning to cloud his vision. But there was a surprising strength in her grip, an undeniable competence in her eyes. He allowed her to help him to his feet, a wave of dizziness washing over him. As she guided him toward the house, neither of them noticed the small face watching from the kitchen window, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a dawning, reluctant curiosity. Maddie saw the blood, and she saw this strange woman holding her father up, not with fear, but with a steady calm. Inside, Lila took command. She had him sit at the kitchen table while she fetched a basin of hot water, soap, and the small leather satchel she had kept from her father, a country doctor who had believed his daughter should know how to mend what could be mended. She worked with a deftness that surprised Jonah. Her touch was firm but gentle as she washed away the dirt and blood. Her brow furrowed in concentration. "This will hurt," she said, her voice soft. She took a pair of tweezers from the satchel. With a surgeon's precision, she gripped the end of the splinter and pulled. Jonah flinched, his breath hissing through his teeth, but he did not pull away. She then threaded a needle with clean gut. "My father taught me," she said, answering his unspoken question. "He said a woman in the West should know more than just needlepoint." She began to stitch the wound, her movements quick and economical. 7 neat, black stitches to pull the torn flesh back together. Jonah watched her, a strange feeling churning in his gut. He was used to Eleanor's ministrations, her soft, worried clucking whenever he came in with a cut or a bruise. Lila was different. There was no fuss, no flutter of anxiety. There was only a quiet, focused capability. He felt a flicker of admiration, an unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with memory. The feeling was so foreign it startled him, and the guilt that followed was immediate and sharp, a cold dousing of water. He was staring at this woman's hands, thinking of how steady they were, while Eleanor was cold in the ground. He looked away, his jaw tightening. When she was finished, she wrapped his arm in clean linen. "Keep it clean, and do not try to break any more horses for a few days." She stood and washed her hands in the basin, her back to him, the intimacy of the moment, a shared crisis in the quiet kitchen, evaporated as quickly as it had formed. The silence returned, heavier than before. The next morning, Lila put on her best dress, the dark serge she had been married in, and walked the 2 miles to the schoolhouse. She carried with her a fragile hope that this one part of her life, the part that was truly hers, might have been spared. The children were already gathering, their bright faces a welcome sight. But as she reached the door, she found her way blocked. Mrs. Miller stood there, flanked by 2 other women from the church. Their faces were set in expressions of stern propriety. "Lila, Mrs." Miller began, not using her new married name. "We need to have a word." She led Lila inside the empty schoolroom. The smell of chalk dust and old paper, usually a comfort, felt like an accusation. "The school board has met, Mrs." Miller announced, her voice devoid of any warmth. "And we have decided that, given your new circumstances, it would be inappropriate for you to continue in your position as teacher." Lila felt the blood drain from her face. "Inappropriate? I am the same teacher I was last week." "You are a married woman now," one of the other women chimed in. "Your place is at home, caring for your husband and that poor, motherless child." "My husband does not need my care, and the child does not want it," Lila said, her voice dangerously quiet. "But these children do. I am a good teacher." "Your marital status sets a moral example." "Mrs." Miller said, as if reciting from a script. "It would not do to have a wife performing public work. It suggests a lack of provision from her husband. The position requires a single woman, unburdened by domestic duties." It was a dismissal, couched in the language of concern. They were stripping her of her vocation, her one source of independence and self-worth. The pain of it was a physical blow, echoing old wounds from a life back east where her sharp mind and unmarried status had always been viewed with suspicion. She was once again being told she did not fit. She looked at their closed, determined faces and knew there was no point in arguing. She gave a single, stiff nod, turned without another word, and walked out of the schoolhouse, the cheerful sounds of the children in the yard mocking her defeat. That evening, unable to bear the silence of the house, Lila found herself in the small study where Jonah's father-in-law had kept the ranch's business records. Dust motes danced in the fading light. In a large wooden chest, she found stacks of old ledgers. On a whim, she began to sift through them. Most were simple accounts of cattle sales and feed purchases, but one book was different. It was a record of local loans and debts, meticulously kept. She found the entry for the loan Silas Pike had made to Jonah, and then she started seeing other names. The blacksmith, the stable owner, the widow who ran the mercantile. Page after page detailed loans from Pike's bank, and on many of them, she recognized the same dense paragraph of legalese, the same predatory, compounding interest clause. Then she examined the signatures. She found a dozen documents signed by Silas Pike over a period of several years. As she compared them, a strange detail emerged. The signatures were not all identical. Some were signed with a flourish, others more hastily. But on all the loans with the predatory clause, the signature was subtly different. The S was harder, more angular. The P lacked its usual loop. It was a small thing, something most would overlook. But to Lila's trained eye, it looked like a forgery. A careful but imperfect imitation. Was it possible someone else was signing these ruinous addendums onto existing, legitimate loans? She sat back in the dusty chair, the ledger open on her lap. The dismissal from the school had left her feeling like a victim, a passive pawn in a game played by men. But this was different. This was a puzzle. This was a weapon. She had found another crack in Silas Pike's fortress, wider and deeper than the one she had noticed in the church. Later, as twilight bled across the high plains, she saw Jonah by the corral, coiling his rope. He did it with an easy, practiced grace, his hands moving in a rhythm as old as ranching itself. He formed a loop, a specific kind of knot she had seen him use before. It was simple, elegant, and strong. She walked over, keeping a respectful distance. "What do you call that knot?" He did not look up, his hands still moving. "A Honda knot, for a lariat." "Could you show me how to tie it?" He stopped and finally looked at her. His eyes were shadowed. "Guarded?" He seemed surprised by the question. "What for?" "I like to know how things work," she said simply, "and it seems like a useful thing to know out here." He hesitated for a long moment. Then, with a gruff sigh, he uncoiled a section of the rope and in a few swift motions, showed her how the end was passed back through itself to form the sliding loop. He did not explain. He just did. Lila watched his hands, memorizing the way the rope bent and folded, the way a simple series of turns created something that could hold 1,000 pounds of angry steer. It was a language of its own, a language of tension and purpose, a language she was determined to learn. She was no longer just the unwanted wife. She was a woman with a secret, looking for the right knot to pull, the one that would unravel everything. The dust of Silas Pike's carriage announced his arrival long before the carriage itself appeared. Jonah saw the plume from the west pasture, and his hand instinctively went to the axe handle leaning against the barn. A cold, familiar rage began to simmer in his belly. He had known Pike would not let them be. A man like that had to poke at his possessions to make sure they were still his. By the time the carriage rolled to a stop in the yard, Jonah was standing on the porch, his feet planted wide, his arms crossed over his chest. Pike emerged, followed by Deputy Hale, who had the decency to look uncomfortable, his eyes fixed on his own boots. Lila came out of the house and stood beside Jonah. She did not look at Pike. She looked at the deputy. Pike beamed, a picture of oily benevolence. "Jonah, my boy, and the lovely Mrs. Cole, I trust you are settling into married life. I was just passing by on my way to the survey camp and thought I would stop in. A friendly visit and a quick inspection of the assets securing my loan. A formality." The word formality grated on Jonah's nerves. He felt the muscles in his jaw bunch. Before he could speak, Lila stepped forward. Her voice was as calm and cool as spring water. "Of course, Mr. Pike, we understand your need for due diligence. To that end, I assume you have the original loan agreement with you, for us to compare against our copy?" The question hung in the dry air. It was so reasonable, so simple, that it completely disarmed the aggression of the moment. Pike's smile faltered for a heartbeat. Deputy Hale shuffled his feet. Of course, the bank has the original." Pike recovered smoothly. "But it is filed away for safekeeping. This is just an informal look around. But how can we be certain you are inspecting the correct collateral without referencing the original document that lists it?" Lila pressed, her tone one of genuine, polite confusion. "Our copy could have a transcription error. I am sure you, as a careful businessman, would want to avoid any such misunderstanding." Deputy Hale looked up, his gaze meeting Lila's for a second. He saw no fire, no challenge. He saw only logic, and it made his position feel suddenly flimsy and foolish. He was here as the law to enforce a contract, but the woman was pointing out they did not even have the contract with them. Pike's eyes narrowed. He was not used to being so neatly boxed in, especially not by a woman. He saw that pressing the issue would make him look like a bully and a fool in front of his legal muscle. "A fine point, Mrs. Cole," he said, his voice a little tighter than before. "A very fine point, perhaps another time. For now, we will just enjoy the view." He cast a proprietary gaze over the ranch. The house, the corrals, everything looked to be in good order. Excellent. He turned back to the carriage. "Deputy." Hale tipped his hat, a gesture that was more for Lila than for Pike, and followed him. As the carriage pulled away, Jonah looked at Lila, a new and grudging respect dawning in his eyes. He would have met the threat with force. She had met it with a question, and she had won the field without a single shot fired. That night, a storm of a different kind broke inside the house. A thin, terrified wail cut through the darkness from Maddie's room. Jonah was out of bed in an instant, but as he reached the hallway, he saw a sliver of light from under Lila's door. She was already moving. He stopped, hesitating. He heard Lila's soft footsteps, then the quiet creak of Maddie's door. He crept closer, listening. Maddie was sobbing, caught in the grip of a nightmare. "No," she cried. "Do not take her. Let her stay." Jonah's heart clenched. He knew the dream. Maddie had been having it for months. A dream where a dark shape came and tried to pull Eleanor away from her. He heard Lila's voice, a low murmur. "It is all right, child. You are safe. It was only a dream. She is gone. Maddie wept. You sent her away. Lila was silent for a moment. Then, very softly, she began to sing. It was not a hymn or a nursery rhyme Jonah recognized. The melody was simple, melancholic, a folk tune from a place far away from the red dust of New Mexico. Her voice was clear and unadorned, filled with a quiet sadness that seemed to understand the child's grief. She sang of a ship with silver sails and a star that waited to guide it home. Slowly, Maddie's sobs subsided, replaced by shuddering breaths. Jonah stood in the dark hallway, a knot in his throat. He was hearing this woman, his wife, comfort his child in a way he had not been able to. The song was not meant for him, but it reached him all the same. It was a moment of grace in the heart of their broken home, and it cracked something open inside of him. The ice that had formed around his heart did not melt, but he could feel a definite fracture. The next morning, Lila approached him after breakfast. She carried the old ledger book from the study. She opened it on the kitchen table. "Jonah, we need to talk," she said. "I believe Silas Pike is a thief." She showed him the pages, the different signatures, the predatory clauses attached to the loans of their neighbors. She explained her theory about the forged editions. And then she pointed to the entry for his own loan, the one he and she had signed in the church. She showed him the effective date. July 15th. "He is charging you interest for a month that passed before this agreement even existed," she explained. "It is not just immoral. I believe it is illegal." Jonah stared at the spidery ink, his mind struggling to catch up. He understood horses and cattle, weather and water. He did not understand this world of paper and tricks, but he understood theft. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice low. "He is the law in Red Bluff." "He is not the law everywhere," she said. "There is a lawyer in Denver, a woman named Ada Fletcher. I have heard of her. They say she is very sharp, and she is not afraid of men like Pike. We need to take these books to her. We need to fight him with the law, not with our fists." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for the first time since she had arrived. He saw the intelligence in her clear eyes, the resolve in the set of her jaw. She was not just the woman who had tended his wound or sung to his daughter. She was a fighter. He made a decision. "All right," he said, "we will go." They left 2 days later, leaving a nervous Molly in charge of Maddie, who accepted the arrangement with a surprising lack of protest. The journey to Denver was long. 2 days in the wagon under a vast, unforgiving sky. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer heavy with resentment, but filled with a shared, unspoken purpose. They traveled through a landscape of raw, savage beauty. Red rock canyons gave way to endless plains of sun-cured grass. In the evenings, they made camp, and the immensity of the stars overhead seemed to pull the truth from them. Lila spoke of her father, the country doctor. He was a good man. She said, her voice soft in the firelight, but he was a sad man. He always said the world was a beautiful place full of people who had forgotten how to be kind to one another. Jonah found himself talking about his own father, a hard man who had carved Half Moon out of the wilderness with his bare hands. "He taught me how to work," Jonah said, staring into the flames. "But he never taught me how to rest. He never knew how himself. Eleanor was the one who taught me that." It was the first time he had said his late wife's name to Lila. It felt both like a betrayal and a relief. Lila just nodded, understanding that some things did not need a reply. They arrived in Denver, a bustling, noisy city of brick and progress that made Red Bluff feel like a forgotten outpost. Ada Fletcher's office was on the second floor of a new brick building. The sign on the door simply said, A. Fletcher, Attorney at Law. Ada Fletcher was a woman in her 40s with shrewd, intelligent eyes and hair pinned up in a severe but practical bun. She wasted no time on pleasantries. She took the ledgers, listened to Lila's story, and examined the loan agreement with a focused intensity. After nearly an hour of silence, she looked up. "Mrs. Cole, your instincts are impeccable," She tapped a finger on the agreement. This retroactive effective date is fraudulent. The interest clause as written constitutes usury under territorial law. And this language here, the acceleration clause allowing him to call the entire note due, it is deliberately ambiguous. As for these other documents, she peered at the signatures through a magnifying glass. The variations are subtle, but consistent. I believe you are right. This is not the work of one man. This is a pattern of systematic fraud. For the first time in 2 years, Jonah felt a flicker of real hope. Ada Fletcher was already pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward her. I will draft a letter to Mr. Pike and the Red Bluff Bank. It will inform them that they are in violation of contract law and are under investigation for fraudulent practices. I will demand a full restructuring of your loan to fair market terms, with all fraudulent interest charges nullified. If they refuse, we will file a civil suit, and I will forward my findings to the territorial governor. She looked at them. We will send it by telegraph. It will arrive tomorrow. Let us see how brave Mr. Pike is when the law starts talking back from 100 miles away. That evening, drained but buoyed by a fragile optimism, they sought lodging. The clerk at the hotel gave them an apologetic look. I am sorry, folks. The Cattlemen's Association is in town. I have only got one room left, a small one with just the one bed. An awkward silence fell between them. To go out and search for another hotel would feel like a retreat, an admission that their strange, unconsummated marriage was a sham. We will take it, Jonas said, his voice firm. The room was small, dominated by a large brass bed. That night, they prepared for sleep in a clumsy, careful silence. Lila changed into her nightgown in the privacy of the washroom, while Jonah simply removed his boots and shirt. He lay down on top of the covers on one side of the bed, his back to the center. Lila, after a moment's hesitation, slipped beneath the covers on the far other side, a veritable chasm of mattress and blankets between them. The darkness was thick and intimate. The sounds of the city outside were a distant murmur. I am afraid, Lila said, her voice barely a whisper. I am afraid that even if we win, I will have no place to go. I am not a teacher anymore, and I am not really a wife. Jonah lay perfectly still, the truth of her words hitting him with surprising force. He had been so consumed by his own fear of losing the ranch, of failing Eleanor's memory, that he had never once considered Lila's. I am afraid, he heard himself say, the words coming out rough, that if I lose Half Moon, I will have nothing left of her, that I will have failed her. And Maddie. He rolled over to face her. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he could just make out the shape of her, a still form in the vastness of the bed. They were two strangers, bound by a contract, sharing their deepest fears in the anonymous dark. There was no touch, no romantic gesture, but it was the most honest moment they had ever shared. It was a different kind of knot, not one of constraint, but one of a shared, fragile trust, tied quietly in the dark. They returned to Half Moon Ranch under a sky the color of a bruised plum. The air was heavy and still, carrying the metallic scent of distant rain. The fragile hope they had carried back from Denver seemed to wither in the oppressive atmosphere. They found Molly O'Rourke on the porch, her face grim, a bucket of water at her feet. He sent his answer. She said, her voice tight with anger. She gestured with her chin toward the small hay shed that stood 100 yards from the main barn. It was a ruin of charred timber and blackened earth. Smoke, thin and acrid, still curled into the motionless air. The fire had been deliberate, set to destroy but not to spread to the larger barn. It was a message, written in ash and smoke. Beyond the shed, a section of fence that bordered the creek had been torn down, the posts ripped from the ground, the wire snipped and curled like dead vines. It was a violation, a calculated act of waste and intimidation. Silas Pike had received Ada Fletcher's telegraph, and this was his reply, not in words, but in violence. Jonah's face became a mask of cold fury. He walked to the smoldering ruins, his boots crunching on scorched earth. The hope he had felt in Denver curdled into a familiar, helpless rage. This was Pike's territory. The law from 100 miles away was just a whisper here. On the ground. Fire and force were the languages that spoke loudest. Lila felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This was no longer a battle of ledgers and legal arguments. Pike had escalated the conflict, bringing it home to their doorstep. She looked at Jonah, at the rigid line of his back and the clenched fists at his sides, and she saw a man being pushed toward a place he could not return from. The next day, they went into Red Bluff for supplies. The mood in town was different. People who had once nodded a curt greeting now looked away. Their faces closed and shuddered. News of the fire had traveled fast, as had the rumors that Jonah Cole was foolishly trying to fight Silas Pike. No one wanted to be seen taking sides, which, in a town owned by Pike, meant they had already chosen his. At the Mercantile, as Lila was paying for flour and beans, a group of older boys, sons of men who worked for Pike, cornered Maddie near the pickle barrel. She had been trailing her father, a small, silent shadow, but had stopped to look at a display of ribbons. "That's the crazy man's girl," one of the boys, a lanky youth with a mean-spirited smirk, said loudly. "My PA says your new ma's a witch who put a spell on him." Maddie shrank back, her face paling. She clutched the worn calico of her dress, her lower lip trembling. "She is not my ma," she whispered, but the words were lost in the boys' jeering laughter. The Mercantile owner, busy with another customer, pretended not to notice. Jonah, at the far end of the counter haggling over the price of fence wire, had not heard. Lila saw it all. Something inside her, a fierce, protective instinct she did not know she possessed, ignited. She set her parcels down on the counter with a firm thud and walked over to the boys. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. She simply moved into their circle, placing herself between them and Maddie. "Excuse me," she said, her voice even and calm. "Did you have a question for this young lady?" The lead boy swaggered. "We were just saying." "I know what you were saying." Lila cut him off, her gaze level and direct. "And I would advise you to think very carefully about what you say next. Words, you see, are like seeds. You plant a hateful one, and you never know what kind of bitter fruit it will grow. Sometimes, that fruit can be very unpleasant to harvest. Do you understand my meaning?" There was no threat in her tone, only a chilling certainty. It was the same quiet authority she had used on the panicked horse, the same logic she had used on Deputy Hale. The boy's smirk faltered. He looked into her eyes and saw not a witch, but a woman who was entirely unafraid of him. He and his friends mumbled something and shuffled away, suddenly finding the Cracker Barrel intensely interesting. Lila knelt down in front of Maddie. The little girl was still trembling, her eyes wide and frightened. Lila held out her hand. "Are you all right?" Maddie looked at Lila's outstretched hand. She looked up at her face, and then, for the first time, she reached out and slipped her small, cold fingers into Lila's. It was a tentative, fragile connection, but it was a connection nonetheless. A silent acknowledgement. "You stood for me." Jonah turned just in time to see his daughter take his wife's hand. He saw the boys slink away. He saw the look on Lila's face, a mixture of fierce resolve and a surprising tenderness. And he felt that crack inside his chest widen just a little more. A few days later, a second telegraph arrived from Ada Fletcher. It was an ultimatum. Pike had 48 hours to respond to her offer of renegotiation. If he did not, she was filing suit in the territorial court and sending a formal complaint, along with copies of the fraudulent ledgers, directly to the governor's office. She was calling his bluff. The news did little to lift the siege mentality that had settled over the ranch. The burned shed was a constant reminder of their vulnerability. The days grew hotter, the air thicker. The creek, which usually ran clear and steady, had turned sluggish and brown. The cottonwoods along its banks had begun to droop, their leaves a sickly yellow. "The monsoon is coming," Jonah said one afternoon, his eyes on the bruised horizon. "Late this year, it will be bad when it hits." The seasonal floods were a fact of life in the canyons. Every year, the dry arroyos and washes could turn into raging torrents in a matter of minutes, a wall of water and debris that swept away everything in its path. He began spending his afternoons down by the creek, checking the banks, clearing brush, and reinforcing the fence Lila's argument had saved from further destruction. One day, Lila followed him down, carrying a canteen of water. She found him practicing with his rope, tossing it over a high cottonwood branch. "You have to be ready," he said, his voice grim. "When the flood comes, you might only have a second to secure yourself or someone else." He looked at her, then at her hands, which he now knew to be surprisingly strong and steady. "You should learn." He spent the next hour teaching her. He moved beyond the simple Honda knot and showed her knots for rescue, knots for survival. He showed her how to tie a bowline, a loop that would not slip, around her own waist. He showed her a Prusik hitch, a friction knot that could be used to ascend a rope. He worked with a quiet, intense focus, his hands guiding hers on the rough hemp, correcting her mistakes, making her practice until the movements became second nature. "This one is the most important," he said, his voice low. He guided her hands through the tying of a figure 8 on a bight, a strong, secure loop for anchoring a line. His fingers brushed against hers, a brief, impersonal contact that somehow felt more charged than any touch they had shared. They stood close, the smell of dust, and coming rain, and the clean, earthy scent of the rope mingling between them. They were not husband and wife. They were partners, preparing for a battle against both a man and the elements. As she practiced, her eyes followed the creek bed as it disappeared into a narrow cut in the landscape a half-mile downstream. "What is that?" she asked. Jonah followed her gaze. "Box Canyon. He said creek runs right through it. It is a shortcut to the old mining road, but nobody uses it. Too dangerous. The walls are sheer. When the flash floods come, that canyon becomes a death trap. Fills up like a bathtub in a minute." He mentioned it casually, a simple piece of local geography. But the place held a sudden, dark significance in Lila's mind. A narrow passage, a dangerous shortcut, a place where someone could get trapped. She shivered, despite the heat, a cold premonition running down her spine. The knots in her hands felt heavier, imbued with a purpose she hoped they would never have to serve. The evening air hung thick and still, heavy with the promise of the storm that had yet to break. The 48 hours of Ada Fletcher's ultimatum had passed in a tense, unnatural quiet. There had been no word from Silas Pike, no further acts of vandalism. It was a silence that felt more menacing than any open threat. After a dinner eaten in near silence, Lila found herself drawn to the main barn. The scent of hay and horse was a comfort, something solid and real in a world that had become dangerously uncertain. A single lantern cast a warm, golden glow, pushing back the deep shadows that clung to the corners. Jonah was there, methodically brushing down one of the horses, the rhythmic sweep of the currycomb a soft, rasping sound in the quiet. He had become even more withdrawn in the past 2 days, lost in a place she could not reach. She knew he was tormented by the choice Pike was forcing on him to fight and risk everything, or to surrender and lose his soul. She picked up a length of rope that was coiled over a stall door. Her hands, remembering the lessons from the creek, began to work, trying to form the loops and turns of a bowline knot, but her fingers were clumsy, her mind distracted. The knot collapsed into a useless tangle. She tried again, and again it failed. Jonah finished with the horse and turned, watching her. He walked over, the lantern light carving his face into angles of light and shadow. "You are pulling the rabbit out of the hole the wrong way," he said, his voice a low rumble. He took the rope from her, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He did not seem to notice. He quickly tied the knot, his movements fluid and certain. See? The rabbit comes up through the hole, around the tree, and back down the hole. He handed it back to her. You try. She took the rope, her skin tingling where he had touched her. She focused on his words, on the simple story of the rabbit and the tree. And this time, the knot held, a perfect, secure loop. She looked up at him, a small smile of triumph on her lips. Now the prusik, he instructed, his voice taking on the cadence of a patient teacher. He draped a longer rope over a high beam, creating a stationary line to practice on. She attempted the friction hitch, wrapping the smaller rope around the larger one, but she fumbled the final tuck. It looked messy, unreliable. She let out a sigh of frustration. I will never get this right. We will be swept away in the flood because my knot is sloppy. The tension of the last few days, the fear and the uncertainty, bubbled up in a strange, unexpected way. A half-nervous, half-joking thought slipped out before she could stop it. Punish me with your rope, she said, her voice a little breathless. She looked down at the mangled knot in her hands, for getting it wrong again. The words hung in the warm, hay-scented air between them. It was a foolish thing to say, born of exhaustion and a strange, burgeoning intimacy. A blush crept up her neck. Jonah went completely still. The teasing light in her eyes died, replaced by a flicker of alarm. She had misspoken, crossed a line she did not know existed. But Jonah did not get angry. He did not laugh. He looked at her, his expression serious, his gaze searching her face in the lantern light. He took a slow breath. Lila, he said, his voice quiet but clear. Is that what you want? The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it took her a moment to process. He was not reacting to the joke. He was reacting to the possibility, however faint, that there was a truth behind it. He was asking for consent. No, she whispered, her cheeks burning now. No, of course not. I was just being foolish. He nodded slowly, accepting her answer without judgment. He reached out and gently took the tangled rope from her hands, his fingers lingering on hers for a second longer than necessary. If we are ever going to get through this, he said, his voice low and serious, we have to be honest with each other. No jokes about things like that. If you ever want me to stop, for any reason, you just have to say the word stop. That will be our word. All right. She looked up at him, her heart thudding in her chest. In that moment, he was not the grieving husband or the embattled rancher. He was just a man, offering her safety and respect in a way no one ever had before. The tension did not vanish, but it transformed. The nervous energy that had sparked her foolish comment now warmed into something else, something soft and tremulous and real. All right, she agreed, her voice barely audible. He held her gaze for a long moment, the space between them charged with unspoken thoughts. The barn, with its familiar smells and sounds, felt like a sanctuary, a small pocket of peace in a world that was closing in on them. He raised his hand, as if to touch her face, but then let it drop. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he was near enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He was so tall, so solid. She had the sudden urge to lean against him, to let his strength hold her up. Lila, he said again, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand. It was a kiss of profound, heartbreaking tenderness. It was hesitant, questioning, a soft pressure of his lips against hers. It tasted of dust and sorrow and a desperate, lonely hope. She responded instinctively, her lips softening under his, her hand coming up to rest on the rough fabric of his shirt. The kiss deepened slightly, a shared breath, a moment of quiet discovery. She felt the rigid control he held over himself begin to fray, felt the hard lines of his body soften as he leaned into her. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest in a gentle embrace. She could feel the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek. It was the sound of a life that had been closed off, now, impossibly, beating in time with her own. He held her for a long time, his chin resting on the top of her head. The kiss had ended, but the embrace lingered. It was an anchor in the storm. Finally, he loosened his hold, though he did not let her go completely. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and filled with a turmoil of conflicting emotions. "I am not ready," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "I am not ready to go any further than this. With Eleanor—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. He did not have to. Lila nodded, her heart aching for him, for the ghost that still stood between them. "I know," she said softly. "But," he continued, his voice regaining its strength, his gaze locking with hers, "I want to go on with you, Lila, through this, whatever comes." It was more than she had ever expected to hear from him. It was not a declaration of love, but it was something far more precious. It was a declaration of partnership, a choice. He saw that she was shivering slightly in the cooling night air. He took off his worn canvas jacket and draped it over her shoulders. The fabric smelled of him, of leather and hard work and the open plains. It was an act of simple, uncomplicated care. An aftercare for a moment that had been both more and less than a physical act. "Molly will have put the kettle on," he said, his voice returning to something closer to normal. "Let us go have some tea." As they walked back toward the warm lights of the house, Lila slipped her hand into his fingers, calloused and strong, closed around hers. It felt right. It felt like a knot she had finally learned to tie. A knot not of bondage or obligation, but of trust. In the kitchen, as they sipped hot, sweet tea, Jonah looked at her across the table. "What I feel for you," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It is not what I felt for her. It does not replace it. It is something else, a different truth." Leah's heart swelled. He was untangling the knots of his own grief, finding a way to honor his past without being imprisoned by it. He was making a space for her, not in the empty chair at the table, but beside him, as a partner. The fear of the coming storm was still there, a cold weight in the pit of her stomach, but for the first time since coming to Half Moon, she did not feel entirely alone in it. They were tied together now, not just by Silas Pike's contract, but by a fragile, new rope of their own making. The fragile peace forged in the barn lasted less than a day. The storm, which had been a distant threat, arrived with the fury of a biblical plague. It began not with rain, but with a wind that tore across the plains, a malevolent spirit that ripped shingles from the roof and screamed through the eaves of the house. The sky turned a sickly shade of green and black, and the world grew dark as night. Molly O'Rourke was trying to latch a slamming shutter when they came. Two men on horseback, faces hidden beneath the low brims of their hats, materializing out of the swirling dust. Lila and Jonah were in the main barn, securing the animals, when they heard Molly's sharp, terrified cry. By the time they ran out into the maelstrom, the riders were already 100 yards away. A small, struggling form held in front of one of the men. It was Maddie. Jonah's blood ran cold. The world, which had just begun to open up with a sliver of color, snapped back to a stark, terrifying black and white. For a paralyzing second, he was back in the sick room with Eleanor, watching the life fade from her, utterly helpless. The same crushing, suffocating powerlessness washed over him. "No," he breathed, the word stolen by the wind. Lila grabbed his arm, her grip like iron. Her face was a pale mask of shock, but her eyes were blazing. Jonah, where would they go? His mind was a storm of its own, a vortex of rage and fear. He could not think. He could only feel the terror of loss. A beast he had thought he had buried, now clawing its way up his throat. The first drops of rain began to fall. Huge, heavy drops that splattered in the dust like coins of mud. Molly stumbled toward them, her face ashen. One hand pressed to her cheek where a red mark was already beginning to form. They said Pike was just collecting on his property. She sobbed. They said she was collateral. The word, so cold, so transactional, broke the spell of Jonah's paralysis. Maddie was not collateral. She was his daughter, his heart, and Silas Pike had just ripped her from his chest. The canyon, Lila said, her voice sharp, cutting through the rising howl of the wind. You said it was a shortcut. He would think he could lose us in there before the water gets too high. Jonah's focus snapped into place. The canyon, the death trap. He ran back into the barn, not for a weapon, but for the ropes. He grabbed 2 coils, his movements swift and certain. When he came out, Lila was already leading their 2 steadiest horses out of their stalls. She did not ask what he was doing. She knew. They mounted and rode into the teeth of the gale. The rain was coming down in solid, blinding sheets now, turning the world into a gray, churning chaos. Jonah rode with a reckless fury, his mind fixed on the image of his daughter's terrified face. Lila rode beside him, her expression grim, her eyes scanning the treacherous ground. They reached the entrance to Box Canyon as the storm unleashed its full power. Hail, the size of marbles, began to fall, stinging their faces and drumming a frantic rhythm on the world. The creek was no longer a creek. It was a rising, muddy torrent, a brown serpent coiling through the narrow passage. They could see them, halfway down the canyon. 3 riders, one of them Deputy Hale, huddled against the canyon wall, trying to find shelter under a small overhang. They had underestimated the speed of the storm. They were trapped. Jonah let out a raw, wordless cry and urged his horse forward, into the churning water that was already fetlock deep. "Jonah, wait!" Lila yelled, but he was deaf to everything but the need to get his daughter back. The men in the canyon saw them coming. One of them, a brutish man with a heavy jaw, dismounted and pulled Maddie from the saddle, holding her in front of him like a shield. "That is far enough." "Cole," the man shouted, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the wind and water. "Pike just wants to talk. You give him what he wants. The girl is fine." Deputy Hale stood beside them, his face a miserable portrait of a man at war with himself. His hand was on the butt of his pistol, but he made no move to draw it. He looked from the terrified child to Jonah's advancing figure, his conscience being flayed with every gust of wind. And then his resolve broke. "Jed, this is wrong," Hale said, his voice shaking but clear. "This is not the law. This is a crime." The man holding Maddie laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "This is Pike's law. Hale, now shut your mouth." "No," Hale said. He pulled his pistol, the click of the hammer cocking lost in the storm. But he did not point it at Jonah. He pointed it squarely at the man named Jed. "Let the girl go. Now. Enough is enough." The betrayal shocked Jed into a moment of inaction. In that single, critical moment, the ground beneath them, already saturated and undermined by the rising flood, gave way with a wet, sucking sound. The ledge they were standing on sheared away. Maddie cried out as she lost her footing. She slid, scrabbling for purchase on the slick, muddy rock, and came to a stop on a narrow finger of stone just above the raging water, which was now a churning, debris-filled monster. She was trapped, her small face a white blur of terror against the dark, wet rock. Jonah's heart stopped. He leaped from his horse, ready to plunge into the torrent, to do anything, however reckless. "Jonah!" "No!" Lila screamed, her voice cracking with urgency. She was off her own horse in an instant, one of the rescue ropes already in her hand. "The rope, you have to be the anchor. It is the only way." Her words penetrated his panic. He looked at her, at the fierce certainty in her eyes, and he understood. This was not a fight for his fists. This was a test of everything they had prepared for. He took the end of the rope she threw him, his hands working with a speed born of desperation and long practice, securing it around the base of a solid, deep-rooted cottonwood. He braced his feet, leaning back, his muscles straining as he took the weight. He was the anchor. Everything depended on him holding firm. Lila moved with a breathtaking efficiency. She tied a bowline around her own waist, a circle of trust in the midst of chaos. She did not hesitate. She began to work her way down the treacherous, muddy slope toward Maddie, her life depending on Jonah and the rope that connected them. She was halfway to the terrified child when she saw the next horror. The narrow ledge where Maddie was perched was crumbling, chunks of it falling away into the angry water below. There was no time. "Maddie, listen to me!" Lila shouted over the roar. "I am going to swing another rope to you. You have to catch it." Lila pulled the second, shorter rope from her shoulder, with one hand clinging to her own safety line. She tied a loop and swung it toward the child. Maddie, sobbing, reached for it, her small fingers missing it on the first try. Again, Lila yelled. She swung it again, and this time Maddie caught it, holding on with the strength of sheer terror. "Hold on tight," Lila instructed, her mind racing, remembering the knot, the Prusik hitch. She needed to secure Maddie to the main line. She worked feverishly, her fingers numb with cold, tying the friction knot, the small rope biting into the larger one, creating a second, movable anchor. She was just cinching it tight when the last of the ledge under Maddie dissolved into the flood. The girl screamed as she swung free, her full weight dropping onto the line. The shock of it tore through the rope, and Jonah grunted, his boots sliding in the mud as he fought to hold his ground. He was holding them both now, his daughter and his wife, 2 lives suspended over the abyss, connected to him by a single strand of hemp. It was the culmination of all his fears, the terror of losing someone he loved. A feeling he knew all too well was a physical force trying to rip the rope from his hands. But this time was different. He was not helpless. He was their anchor. He locked his arms, drove his heels deeper into the mud, and held. "Pull!" "Jonah!" Lila screamed, her voice raw. She had Maddie in her arms, a cold, shivering bundle. "Pull!" He pulled with every ounce of strength in his body, muscles screaming in protest. It was a slow, agonizing battle against gravity, mud, and the sucking force of the flood. He saw Lila, her face streaked with mud and rain, her arms wrapped around his daughter, protecting her, fighting for her. He saw them rising, inch by agonizing inch, from the churning death below. With one final, desperate heave, he pulled them over the lip of the bank and onto solid ground. They collapsed in a heap of soaked clothing and shuddering limbs. The canyon wall behind them finally gave way completely, a huge section of it crashing into the water with a deafening roar, sending a wave surging through the passage where they had been moments before. Jonah crawled to them, his arms wrapping around them both, pulling them into a fierce, protective embrace. He held his daughter, who was crying his name, and he held his wife, who had just saved her. He buried his face in Lila's wet hair, a ragged sob tearing from his throat, a sound of terror and relief, and a love so fierce it left him breathless. The ghost of his grief was finally, decisively, washed away by the flood. What remained was this solid, breathing reality. His family, safe. Deputy Hale stumbled toward them, his face pale, his gun still in his hand. Jed, the other kidnapper, was gone, swept away by the current. "I am a witness," Hale said, his voice hoarse. "I will tell them everything. I will tell them Pike ordered it." The storm was beginning to break, and in its aftermath, the truth was finally coming to light. The journey back to Red Bluff was a slow, sodden affair. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and brutally rearranged. Jonah drove the wagon. with Lila and a sleeping Maddie huddled together under a thick wool blanket in the back. Deputy Hale rode alongside. A silent, grim-faced man stripped of his authority but in possession, for the first time in a long while, of his own conscience. They did not go to the ranch. They went straight into town. The story had arrived before them, carried on the receding floodwaters and the tongues of the few ranchers who had witnessed the dramatic rescue from the canyon rim. When they pulled up in front of the deputy's office, people emerged from the mercantile and the saloon, their faces a mixture of awe, curiosity, and a dawning, collective shame. They saw Jonah Cole, not as a broken widower, but as a man who had walked into the jaws of a flood to save his child. They saw the schoolteacher, Lila Hart, her face bruised and her dress torn, clutching the little girl as if she were her own. And they saw Deputy Hale, his head bowed, walk into his own office and formally turn himself in, not as a criminal, but as the primary witness to one. Silas Pike's power had been built on a foundation of quiet intimidation and the illusion of lawfulness. In the space of one afternoon, Jonah and Lila had exposed the rot beneath the floorboards. The kidnapping of a child was a line that could not be unseen, a crime that even a town strangled by debt could not stomach. 2 days later, the stagecoach from Denver rattled into town. It carried not just mail and passengers, but a formidable, clear-eyed woman in a practical traveling suit. Ada Fletcher stepped onto the dusty street, carrying a leather satchel overflowing with legal documents. She had not waited for a reply to her ultimatum. She had acted. She was armed with more than just Jonah and Lila's case. Her telegraph messages had flown across the territory, and the replies had trickled back, painting a damning portrait. From Santa Fe to Silver City, she had found other ranchers, other merchants, other widows, all with similar stories, all with loan documents bearing that same subtly forged signature next to clauses of ruinous interest. She had not just found a single crime, she had uncovered a conspiracy of greed that spanned half the New Mexico territory. With her was a territorial marshal, a tall, quiet man whose authority did not depend on the goodwill of a local banker. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. Pike, arrogant to the last, tried to bluster and bribe his way out, but his local influence meant nothing in a territorial court. Deputy Hale's tearful, detailed testimony of the kidnapping, coupled with the mountain of financial evidence Ada presented, sealed his fate. The court nullified the unconscionable contract on Half Moon Ranch. More than that, it placed Pike's assets, his bank, his land holdings, into receivership, pending a full audit and restitution to the dozens of families he had systematically defrauded. The kidnapping charge would see him sent to the territorial prison for a very long time. Red Bluff was free. Jonah Cole found himself with a future for the first time in 2 years. He sold the string of well-trained horses he had been gentling, the ones meant to pay the interest on a debt he no longer owed. The price was good. That money, combined with the restitution ordered by the court, was enough. He walked into the land office, not the bank, and paid off the original, legitimate mortgage on his father's ranch. He filed the paperwork for the water rights to his spring, securing the lifeblood of Half Moon for generations to come. He walked out into the sunlight a free man, the weight of the past finally lifted from his shoulders. He was no longer just defending a memory. He was actively building a future. Lila, too, began to build. She found she was no longer an outcast. The women of the town, who had once shunned her, now approached her with a quiet, respectful admiration. They had seen her courage at the mercantile, had heard of her bravery in the canyon. She was not just the schoolteacher anymore. She was a woman who stood up, who fought back. The old schoolhouse remained closed, a monument to the petty tyranny of the former school board. So Lila started a new one, with a group of other women, including a humbled and apologetic Mrs. Miller. She cleaned out an abandoned storeroom behind the church. They brought in benches, scrubbed the floors, and washed the windows. Lila began to hold classes, not just for the children, but for anyone who wanted to learn. She taught women to read so they could understand the contracts their husbands signed. She taught basic first aid and sanitation, the lessons her doctor father had taught her, so they would not be helpless when fever struck. She charged a small fee, and with the money, they began to build a town library, a collection of books and knowledge that could not be foreclosed upon. She was no longer just a woman looking out for herself. She was the heart of a community, connecting people, making them stronger together. The change in the house at Half Moon was just as profound. The silence was gone, replaced by the sound of Maddie's chatter, the murmur of conversation over dinner, the easy rhythm of a family. One morning, Jonah quietly removed the empty chair from the dining table and put it in the attic. No one mentioned it, but its absence was a comfort, a final acknowledgement that they were no longer a family of ghosts and gaps, but a new shape, whole and complete in its own way. Maddie blossomed in the warmth of her new security. The nightmares ceased. She followed Lila everywhere, from the garden to the new library, her hand often finding its way into Lila's. The fear of being replaced had vanished, supplanted by the quiet confidence of a child who knows she is loved, doubly and fiercely. One evening in late spring, when the rains had passed and the desert was in the full, glorious flush of its brief bloom, Jonah asked Lila to walk with him. He led her up the low mesa that overlooked the ranch, a place he had often gone to be alone with his grief. But tonight, he was not alone. The top of the mesa was covered in blooming hedgehog cacti, hundreds of them. Their fierce, spiny bodies had burst forth with blossoms of an impossible, brilliant magenta, a testament to the life and beauty that could endure in the harshest of lands. They stood for a long time, watching the sun set, painting the vast sky in shades of orange and rose. The air was cool and clean. When Eleanor died, Jonah began, his voice quiet, stripped of all its old defenses. I thought the only thing I had left to do was to hold on, to protect what was hers. This land, Maddie. I thought that was the only way to honor her, to keep her alive somehow. He turned to face Lila, his eyes clear and full of a deep, gentle emotion. I was wrong. A memory is not a house you live in. It is a foundation you build on. You taught me that. He reached out and took her hands in his. You walked into my life when it was all stone and silence. Lila, you tended my wounds. You sang to my daughter. You showed me how to fight. Not just with my hands, but with my head and my heart. You showed me how to live again. He took a deep breath, the words he had held back for so long finally rising to the surface. I love you, Lila. Not as a replacement for what I lost. As the woman you are, I love you. Tears welled in Lila's eyes. Tears not of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. He was not haunted anymore. He spoke of his first wife with a gentle respect, as a cherished part of his past, not a shadow darkening his present. He had untied the final, most difficult knot of his own heart. He had made a space for her, clean and new and sunlit. I love you too, Jonah Cole, she said, her voice thick with tears, and in the warm glow of the setting sun, surrounded by the fierce, beautiful flowers of the desert. He kissed her, not with the hesitant tenderness of their first kiss in the barn, but with the sure, steady promise of a lifetime. The first annual Rain Thanksgiving in Red Bluff was unlike any celebration the town had ever held. It was not a somber affair of religious piety, but a joyous, boisterous gathering in the newly cleared town square. The memory of the flood, and of the corruption that had nearly drowned them all, was still fresh. But it was a memory that no longer held the power of fear. It was a scar that reminded them of a wound that had healed, leaving them stronger. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted chickens, fresh bread, and pies of every description. Music from a fiddle and a harmonica filled the air, and at the center of it all, treated not as curiosities but as honored guests, were Jonah, Lila, and Maddie Cole. Reverend Miller, his spine noticeably straighter these days, stood on a wooden platform and cleared his throat. He spoke not of damnation, but of community, of the courage of ordinary people, and of new beginnings. Then he called Lila to the stage. A hush fell over the crowd. Lila, in a simple blue dress she had made herself, walked to the podium. Mrs. Miller stepped forward, her face beaming, and handed Lila a rolled-up document tied with a blue ribbon. On behalf of the newly formed Red Bluff Town Council and School Board, Mrs. Miller announced, her voice ringing with a genuine warmth that had been absent before. We would like to present Lila Cole with a formal contract to be our town's teacher. She paused, then added with emphasis, a contract that explicitly states that her marital status is, and always will be, considered an asset to her character, not a disqualification for her profession. A wave of heartfelt applause swept through the square. It was more than a job offer. It was a public apology and a formal acceptance. Lila was no longer the outsider. The spinster forced into a strange marriage. She was theirs. She was the woman who had faced down bullies and bankers, who had organized a library from nothing, who had helped heal their town. She unrolled the contract, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and signed her name with a steady hand. Life at Half Moon Ranch settled into a new, deeper rhythm. The scars on the land began to heal, and new life took root. Jonah, with an eye toward a future that stretched for decades, began planting an orchard of apple trees on the south-facing slope of the mesa. It was slow, back-breaking work, an act of pure faith in the seasons to come. He and Lila worked together to build new fences, dig new irrigation ditches for the orchard, and install a proper water trough for the horses, fed by the clear, steady spring he now owned without question. The rope that had saved them from the flood, too frayed for heavy work but too full of meaning to discard, was coiled and hung on a peg on the front porch. It was not a grim reminder, but a kind of talisman. It was a symbol of the knots that had bound them in fear and obligation, and of the ones they had since learned to tie for themselves, knots of trust, partnership, and family. One evening, after a long day of work, the house was quiet. Maddie was asleep, her breathing soft and even in her small room. Molly had gone to her own cottage an hour earlier. A gentle breeze, cool with the scent of pine from the high country, drifted through the open windows. Jonah and Lila sat at the kitchen table, finishing a last cup of tea. The lantern cast a soft, intimate glow, turning the familiar room into a private world. Jonah reached across the table and took her hand. His thumb traced the small calluses that were beginning to form on her palm, a testament to the work they had shared. "Do you remember that night in Denver?" he asked, his voice low. "In that hotel room?" "I remember being afraid," she said softly. "I was afraid too," he admitted. "But it was the first time I felt like I was not entirely alone in it, even with all that space between us in that bed." He stood up, pulling her gently to her feet. "There is no space between us anymore. Lila." He led her from the kitchen, through the quiet living room where Eleanor's ghost no longer lingered, and to the closed door of their bedroom. It was a threshold they had never truly crossed together. For months, he had slept in the small spare room, a self-imposed exile out of a grief and guilt that had long since dissolved. Tonight, there were no more barriers, no more unspoken rules. He paused at the door and turned to her, his hands framing her face. His eyes, in the soft light, were full of a deep, unwavering love. "Are you ready?" he asked. It was not a question of desire, but one of final, complete consent, a question of stepping into a life they had both truly chosen. "Yes," she whispered, "I am." He opened the door and led her inside. The room was simple, clean, with a large bed covered in a quilt Molly had made. The moonlight streamed through the window, silvering the floorboards. He did not blow out the lantern, but set it on the nightstand, its warm glow a steady, reassuring presence. There was no haste, no feverish passion. There was only a slow, deliberate tenderness, a reverence in the way he unpinned her hair, letting it fall over her shoulders. There was a profound trust in the way she helped him unbutton his shirt, her fingers tracing the map of scars and sun on his skin. Every touch was a conversation, every glance a confirmation. They were undoing the last of the knots, the invisible ones of restraint and sorrow, and tying the final one, the one of life and love, together. They came together under the soft quilt, two halves of a whole that had been forged in adversity and tempered by respect. It was an act of quiet celebration, a homecoming. It was the warmth of a shared future, the peaceful end to a long storm, a binding of two lives into one, freely and joyfully given. A year later, the apple trees on the mesa were small but sturdy, their leaves green and full of promise. The half-moon ranch was thriving. Inside the house, the late afternoon sun slanted through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Maddie, now a confident 7-year-old, sat on a small stool, a well-worn storybook open on her lap. She was reading aloud, her voice clear and proud. And so the brave knight and the clever princess rode together into the forest to build a new castle all their own. Her audience was a single, captivated soul. Lying in a wooden cradle Jonah had built, a baby boy with a fuzz of dark hair and his father's serious eyes gurgled happily, his tiny fists waving in the air. Jonah and Lila stood in the doorway, watching, their arms around each other. A quiet, bone-deep contentment radiated from them. In the distance, a train whistle blew. It was a familiar sound now, a part of the daily rhythm of the valley. The iron tracks, once a symbol of Silas Pike's rapacious greed, now served the town. But the trains that ran on them were different. They slowed as they approached Red Bluff, a concession to a new community ordinance passed by the town council to ensure the safety of livestock and children. Civilization had arrived, not with the brute force of a locomotive, but with the quiet strength of a negotiated agreement. Jonah looked at Lila, at the family they had built, at the peaceful land stretching out before them. They had survived, and in surviving, they had learned to live with a courage and a dignity they had earned together. Family, they had discovered, was not just about the blood you were born with, but about the people who chose to stand with you in the storm. Thank you so much for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please remember to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.